And while he does that, I will say, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. As you likely are aware, we're just getting things set up. We'll begin in about a minute, and up in the nest, you will find some resources to look through. Feel free to have a look and get yourself acquainted with what we're going to talk about tonight. If you're just joining us, Mr. Bond is just fiddling with his mic and trying to get it to sound like he's not screaming at us anymore. Up in the nest, you will find a bunch of resources as always. You can take a quick minute to look through that while we get his mic sorted out, and we'll begin as soon as we can. Thank you for your patience, everyone.
Actually, having just covered for me, I think that I've got my mic sorted out now, so thanks very much for that. Am I coming through okay to you guys?
Much better.
Perfect, thanks. Okay, so we're just after 9 o'clock, and I'll get started. Thanks very much for joining us tonight. For those who are new to this space, we cover news from around the world, often using some mainstream media sources, but then we try to accent that heavily through the use of open source information, usually from great accounts here on Twitter. In addition to having a look at the news, we are trying to share tools and techniques for open source intelligence analysis, so that whether you're brand new to it or you've been at it a while, hopefully you can find some ways to bring your skills up. In addition, we try to have guests join us in order to present either research that they're doing, projects that they're working on, with the hope that by promoting them to the community, there will be opportunity for those who are interested in collaborating to get together and sort of grow the overall work that's being done. These spaces rely pretty heavily on the use of the nest, which is the area at the top of the spaces window where you can put up links to individual tweets. The reason for that is that I try to bring sources for everything that I present to you, so that you don't have to take my word for very much at all. In addition to that, the idea is that if we cover anything you're interested in, then you can look at these sources and take it away as the start of further reading. To that end, if you have a look at the far right-hand side of the nest, the very first tweet is the invitation to this space. If you were to click through to it, it will open up a thread, and in that thread is my agenda or reading list. So you can see all the sources in one spot as opposed to having to read them individually. That also allows you to look ahead at what we're going to talk about later on. In that way, it might inspire you to develop either questions or comments for those subjects when we get to them. We do invite audience input as much as possible. That's why we host it here on Twitter Spaces as opposed to just recording it and putting it out on YouTube. In order to come up and chat with us, you can request the microphone. It's the button in the bottom left-hand side of the Spaces window. And because we'd like to get as much involvement as possible, if you're enjoying the conversation as we go along, then please consider retweeting the space, which is the button in the bottom right of the Spaces window. I think that's it for introduction. Our topics tonight. So as usual, I'm going to start for about the first 10 or 15 minutes, running through some resources from the last couple of days and some interesting examples of OSINT work. After that, we're joined by a guest tonight, Chris Bollinger. He's going to chat with us about artificial intelligence use, imagery analysis, data science, and potential applications of those all to OSINT, which should be a fascinating conversation. After our conversation with Chris, we'll move on to updates, and we'll have updates on a few items like the destruction of the Nova Kakhovka Dam, even the Nord Stream pipelines. We'll discuss updates on the offensive, and then a couple of more recent developments like the Ukrainian Recovery Conference. Okay, so I'm starting from the right-hand side of the nest, which is that initial invite. If you were to look at the second item from the right, that is just the invitation to our next discussion. I hold these conversations every Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time and every Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. The goal being that we can get a bit more West Coast involvements on Thursday nights and a little bit more European engagement, even though I know it's late on Sunday afternoons. So if you're able to join us, set your reminder for that now. The third item from the right-hand side is just a reminder that friends of our space are actually live streaming this to YouTube as well. I would encourage you to engage with us here on Twitter so that if you'd like to join the conversation, you can do it here. But if you ever miss a discussion and you'd like to go back and catch up on it, or there's some issue that we talked about that you want to go and get a refresher on, you can always have a look at that YouTube account. And, many thanks to our friends who stream it over there, because I know that's a lot of work. The fourth item from the right is our community calendar. If you were to click on any of those, if you click on the link to the Team Up app, it will open up in a browser for you. And then if you click on any of the entries in the calendar, they'll bring up either a registration link for upcoming events, a Spaces reminder button if it's here on Twitter, or if the event's already passed, then there will usually be a recording. The purpose of this is just because the Twitter Space search feature is not very good. And we have a couple of friends of ours who host conversations, usually either about Ukraine or about OSINT more broadly. And we wanted to make sure we weren't overlapping one another. At the same time, we decided since we had it, we would just add outside talks because there were so many, and I wasn't finding any one place that was bringing all of these Ukraine-related talks together. So there you have it. If you have any events you see coming up that you think might be of interest and should be added to the calendar, please do DM them either to myself or to Planet Baroque. I think she changes her name from time to time, but I think it's currently Planet Baroque, who helps with updating the calendar. Okay. The fifth item from the right, it's right in the middle of the nest at the moment, is, actually, I'm sorry. There were, in that same tweet on the calendar, there were two events. I'll just highlight quickly to you. One is a conversation that's being hosted on the 26th. So I think that's this coming Monday. And it features Ivan Krastev and Timothy Snyder. And of course, Timothy Snyder has become pretty well known here on Twitter as a very dedicated historian who covers a lot of events from Ukraine. I think he has an extremely popular lecture course that's available on YouTube on Ukrainian history. So I expect that to be a good conversation. And then the other event coming up next week is next Wednesday. And it is a friend of the space, Sam Bendet, who has been in to chat with us twice now, who is an expert in artificial intelligence and drone applications in the military. He is hosting his very first Twitter space. So I'd ask, if you're available, maybe go out and listen to Sam's discussion, not only because I'm sure it will be, a really interesting conversation, but that it's his first foray in hosting. And I think it's great to encourage people to engage here on Twitter like that. So in the tweet in the middle on podcasts, running through these quickly, there excuse me, there was a discussion just today hosted by the Kiev Independent with several experts. The title was "What's Next in Russia's War Beyond the Counteroffensive?" And a colleague actually of Sam Bendet's, Michael Kaufman, who's one of the foremost experts on Russian military structure and practice, was on that panel. And so that was just this afternoon. I caught parts of it, but not the whole thing. So I'm going to go back and listen to the recording. The second podcast here is actually put out by the Center for Naval Analysis, and it's once again our friend Sam Bendet. He came to speak with us about 2 weeks ago about his report on uncrewed systems. He revisits it here. I have little doubt that we did it better, but there may be new details that have developed since he chatted with us, and you probably can't get enough Sam Bendet. Finally, in podcasts, there was a new podcast put out by Mark Galliotti, who's doing a series profiling Russian political intrigue. And this one is called In Moscow's Shadows, Paranormal Putinism. And I don't think he takes it particularly seriously as influencing policy, but he does note that there are some wild stories that go around. So that one might be a little bit more entertainment than anything else. So if you were to look at I'm now working on the third from the left, switching direction. It's the tweet titled Resources. I'll try and run through these quickly. There was an interesting decision from the oversight panel at Meta, which of course primarily runs Facebook, but I think they also run Instagram, if I'm not mistaken. And it was a decision regarding their policy for international accountability and what sorts of posts are permitted to go up, how they'll manage that. And I saw this one highlighted by Elliot Higgins with the suggestion that it may have a significant influence on the policies at the majority of social media platforms on being a little bit more mindful of the importance of these platforms for sharing information on conflict, and that simply, trying to tamp down or reduce the amount of social media coverage of them is often, not the best solution, because there's a lot of important work that's done on these via social media. The second item there is a tweet from Defmon, who just gives us a handy tip. If you are doing any mapping, and I know that there are friends among us who do, that several of the mappers will make their data available as KML files, which can be used with Google Maps. And as a particular example, he noted that Brady Afric's map that he tracks the Russian fortifications on, there is a step so that if you're doing your maps on Google Maps, you can automatically import the KML files from others, and you can schedule it every day, every 12 hours. And that way you can do, different overlays, making use of the efforts of others who are tracking, little niche elements of maps like fortifications and so on, that add a lot of value. Sometimes there are requests for information that go out just sort of into the OSINT ether, and that can be interesting. One of these requests was sent out by Offbeat Research, which is a newer organization to me. And so I'll put their request up individually in the front of the nest. But they're tracking private military corporations from Russia, and trying to gather an understanding of their structure and so on. And in particular, they were asking for any new evidence, photos or video of members of Levadia, which is apparently a new private military corporation that's operating in the Kherson region. So I know some of you will track Wagner very closely. If anybody comes across references to Levadia, you could pass them along to Offbeat Research. A couple more resources. So this is the fourth tweet back in the nest from the left. I'll note that, and I'll put some of these up individually in the nest, that this week, or I think it was just yesterday, Bellingcat put out their annual report, which details a lot of the projects that they undertook over the last year and some of their planned projects for the coming year. As well, coming up in the front of the nest, Bellingcat put out a new online investigation toolkit, which brings together a bunch of different tools and should be pretty helpful. I haven't looked through it all. I understand a lot of these are tools they've highlighted individually, and this may just be packaging it together in a more convenient format. Finally, for resources, I'll put this up in the front of the nest. There's another outlet called Forensic Architecture that does some great investigation of damage to buildings, so battle damage assessment, implications of responsibility that may flow from that. So it's, a study of the architectural level. And they've put out a new investigative toolkit and published a first video explaining how it works. And so the link to that is now in the nest in case you're interested. There were a couple of great examples of OSINT in the last few days. I'll try and run through these in about 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll move on to our conversation with Chris. So it's now starting with the fifth back in the nest under the title Examples. But I'll put some of these up in the front of the nest as I go along. So these include the BBC has now set up BBC Verify, which is their in-house sort of OSINT team. And some of their first work is looking at satellite imagery, revealing that the water level in the Kakova Reservoir has now fallen below the level of the canals that feed off of it. And so that water source, with all of the negative implications, that water source is now disconnected. There was some interesting speculation put forward by the Lookout, which does often great naval analysis, but in just the last day or so put out a tweet analyzing satellite imagery from Belarus, noting that there's been construction ongoing at one site that is an ammunition base. And his speculation is that it may be that this base may be the center where any nuclear weapons being transferred from Russia may be stored. And so that's not a certainty, but it's a good catch on his part to see that construction underway. And so we'll see if his theory plays out. Similarly, catching new construction, a friend of ours, Radio and Nukes, put out a tweet thread where he, working along with Marcus Johnson, looked at satellite imagery and discovered a new airfield being built in the Luhansk Oblast. So you can check out their examination there. And then I'll move quickly. I had to split them up between two different tweets, so I'm just transferring between them. There's a new tool that's put out. I believe it's sponsored by The Economist. Sorry about that. That a new tool put out sponsored by The Economists that is looking at data from the firm's satellites. And what they did was build a machine learning algorithm in an effort to determine whether the signals it was reporting were fires that were war-related or non-war related. And this is something that people have raised as a caution whenever we discuss firms in the past. And so it's really interesting to see them attempting to algorithmically look at circumstances to see whether they're likely to be in connection with the war. So you might want to have a look at that research. There was a good thread put up by H.I. Sutton, who does lots of great naval analysis, breaking down the evolution of unmanned surface vessels or maritime drones in the Ukrainian war, which is something, we've followed a lot of the updates, whether it be the Ukrainian attacks on Sevastopol or the deployment against the Ivan Kurs or other Russian spy ships. And we've seen more recent evidence that the Russians may be trying to mimic this strategy. So what is known about the various drone types is laid out by H.I. Sutton. Finally, just as an example of overall good work, but then a little bit of frustration, it's the account Tadarigami. And my understanding is that he is a Ukrainian soldier who writes, analysis pieces here on Twitter that have become very popular. And he has been frustrated that some of his work has been picked up by major media outlets without sufficient attribution. And this is a common complaint that we hear. I know that friends of ours, like just the other day, All Source News was complaining that he gave quotes to a newspaper in connection with research he had done and then felt he wasn't properly credited. Or Oryx, who does the losses tracking, notoriously has his data used without full recognition. And so it's an unfortunate side effect, but I just want to keep that matter in your minds with this most recent example from Tatarigami. Okay, I think that's it for the resources. Thanks very much for hanging in there. I think that I like to think that there are probably little gems in there that are relevant to some of our listeners, because we have some listeners who do some very specialized work. However, having covered that, I think we're ready to move on to our conversation with Chris Bollinger. So, Chris, thanks very much for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Michael. It's great to be able to join you and the crew.
I suspect this is going to be a pretty sophisticated conversation, having heard a little bit about your background. But I know that you've been working with my co-host, Riverside Kitty, a little bit. So I'm going to turn it over to her just to walk through with you on your background and some intro into how you came to be interested in these subjects.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Thanks, Michael. And Chris, thank you so much for giving us your time tonight. By way of introduction, I'll just let our listeners know you were a Marine Corps company commander on active duty 1997 through 2001, and then with the State Department in Latin America for 10 years after 9/11. You might want to mute your mic. Yeah. And have been in the tech industry since 2011 with expertise in tech innovation and analytics, which I've learned a lot about from talking to you, and particularly as it relates to national security. You've had your eyes on defense and machine learning and AI for a long time, and AI is nothing new. So would you give us a brief history of the evolution within government and how they started marshaling data, starting with Project Maven, and why the Defense Department created it?
Sure, yeah. So like you said, artificial intelligence isn't anything new, like theoretically, right? Alan Turing, and going back to breaking the Enigma codes in World War II, right? Turing's widely considered the father of AI. There's many, of the leading minds in industry, PhDs, they're in their 50s and 60s now and got their PhDs in artificial intelligence and machine learning 20 to 30 years ago. What's new is making AI more real, right? So cloud distributed computing, parallel processing, and new types of processing, CPUs, computer processing units, or more importantly, graphic processing units, which have been found to be highly efficient for machine learning and AI models. All of those recent developments in the last 10 years have made AI, or at least the initial real world applications of AI, more real, and especially in like enterprise production environments. So, I mean, of course, the U.S. Department of Defense, U.S. government, being very active in advanced research and development for many years, has been spending money on this. And the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the use of intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets, manned and unmanned, produce a tremendous amount of data, right? So, and we're seeing this in the open source community today, right? What data that has traditionally been only the purview of governments is now ubiquitously available to the public and open source intelligence practitioners. So this presents several significant challenges. Like, it's great that there's all of this data now. There's more increased transparency. There's more people being able to get involved. Like you and I have talked about, Riverside Kitty, on, you're curious, you're passionate, you're motivated, the information's out there. We can ask questions, use, well-known analytical tradecraft and provide insights, right? So to support the forces of good in the world. The hard part is there's way too much information at this point for any analyst to process, right? These problems, as Michael's repeated frequently in this discussion, are super complex. So, like, when you have all of this data to be able to bring to bear, like, it becomes incredibly challenging for an analyst or even a team of analysts to sort through this information, find the relevant data, analyze it with rigor, and then be able to provide their analytical conclusions.
Yeah, I think you were even saying that where we used to have data science, it's now broken into different features of it, different specializations within data science. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah, the data science field, it first started with just a data scientist, and we can see this play out if you'd like me to answer the question on like how evolution of AI in the Department of Defense and everything. But data science is now 3 core disciplines. Like, one is data engineering, right? So like AI or machine learning or any data analytics is only good as the data that you put into it. So if garbage in, garbage out, if you want gold nuggets coming out, the end of the process that are truly valuable to whatever the analytical effort is, you need to be very deliberate and disciplined about selecting the data, curating the data, making sure it's compatible, right? To flow through the algorithms, Michael was talking about the importance of sharing KML files when you're doing geospatial work, because KML is the data standard that geospatial analysts can use to import and export data across many different geospatial information systems applications, right? So data compatibility. So going back to, there's data engineering, there's the actual data science, right? Being able to apply math through machine learning or AI to the data to tease the signal from the noise or the breadth of the data. And then there's the analyst, like data analytics is actually, what are the insights? How do I communicate those insights effectively to whatever the audience I'm trying to communicate or support or influence? Does that answer your question in terms of the 3 segments of data science now?
Yeah, it does. I just hadn't realized that there was so much to do. But of course, when you're dealing with huge quantities of data, there have to be steps to refine it, to sort it out, and get the right things to the analysts.
Yeah, an individual open source analyst, like you and I were talking about this, can learn now how to use common open source tools for data science to whatever their field of analytics is. But if you are an enterprise or even a nonprofit analytics firm, an investigative firm like Bellingcat, right? Their team probably at this point segments out into these disciplines because they're doing it at scale versus doing it as an individual or a tag team of 1 to 2 or several people, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It was interesting that you mentioned to me that they're buying some of the services. They go out to buy services. But I just wanted to, if you don't mind, just going through really quickly just the evolution of Project Maven, which was the first AI program in the Department of Defense. Just because I think it's so interesting to see how things started, gathering so quickly and what they did about it.
Yeah, no. So like I said, the department has been researching, doing a lot of R&D on this for years, and not just the government itself, but there's all sorts of research activities in the Department of Defense or across the government, and they contract a lot out to R&D activities and scientists throughout our country and allied countries. So they've been doing this for decades, and then this explosion of data, especially in the post 9/11 conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan, and using new, modern intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, ISR mission systems. These are basically mobile sensor platforms, whether they're manned or unmanned, and they collect a tremendous amount of data, right? So the vast majority of that data is kind of hitting the cutting room floor, so to speak, because the analysts can't, even post-mission, looking at archived data, can't sort and process and analyze the breadth of that data. So in 2017, sorry, go ahead. You had a question?
No, I was going to say, plus weren't different departments gathering different data, and so it wasn't coordinated?
Definitely, right. The Department of Defense, there's the kind of the umbrella organization, but then there's each of the armed forces services. So each of the services under themselves, right, they're the ones that are responsible for, training and equipping their fighting forces, to support their constitutional mission. So they're the ones that procure the systems. They're the ones that train and equip the people to use and operate them. And so you can see a trend in industry is, you hear about interoperability, open data standards and formats, open architecture, right? The old way of building things where they were bespoke systems, like with proprietary architecture. So that means, like, let's say not, whatever systems integrator built the mission system, right? It didn't communicate easily with other mission systems. And because of the speed of data, like all the Defense Department ministries of defense are moving into interoperability because we're fighting as allied coalitions or protecting the world as allied coalitions. It's not just a single nation or government, just like the Ukraine. It's a coalition and a multitude of allied nations and governments. And they need to be able to share information, even on in mission, right? The system is up, it's producing information, and how that information is routed and how people are analyzing it, how they're sharing it, and how they're using and acting upon it is really important, right? So that this has shifted the whole architecture to what commercial industry has done for years. Like we talk about open source, intelligence. Well, there's open source software, there's open source data, there's open data formats. So all of this is kind of parallel things that are converging into one. And then I can quickly summarize the DoD experience if you want me to, in terms of Maven and where that fit in, or we can move on to another topic.
Yeah, if you could just do it quickly, because it'd be great.
Yeah, I'll do it super fast. So we talked about, right, the post 9/11, these ISR systems. So in, I think it's May of 2017, Deputy Secretary of Defense Bob Work, a fellow Marine, created what was called the Algorithmic Warfare Cross-Functional Team, and that Project Maven, right? Project Maven put its arms around roughly 500 to 550 individual AI and machine learning activities that had percolated up over decades across the department and the services, and started focusing people on it. And it was to solve this problem, right, of helping the analysts know where to look and when, and being able to pull signal from the noise from this massive tidal wave of data. That then morphed into the joint AI center, the JAKE, and its latest and most current iteration is there's a chief, digital and AI office, like reporting to the CIO within the Department of Defense, so CDAO. And then Project Maven actually moved from the Department of Defense over the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, the NGA, last year in 2022, because they're the ones that have the largest cadre of geospatial analysts and are using the advancements in this effort, right, to help their analysts know where to look and when to solve this problem. Did that summarize it well for you?
Yeah, really well. What is geospatial intelligence?
So traditionally, geospatial intelligence is looking at imagery, like satellite imagery, or producing maps, cartography. So it blends the sciences of the traditional, centuries-old science of cartography and art of cartography with our understanding of the world. So the modern, using remote sensors, satellites, drones, what have you, right, to map and understand the Earth and our seas and subsurface undersea as well.
Yeah, okay. And so then, it's interesting how we now have a lot of commercial remote sensing data that the DoD purchased, did they? It used to be Maxar was the first high-resolution commercial satellite operator in the U.S., and then...
Correct. So governments only had these traditionally to build a spy satellite, right, is multiple billions of dollars, many, many years. It cost a lot to launch it and operate it, and only a handful of governments in the world had the resources to do that, including the United States. But with advances in, you look at SpaceX, and there's a whole proliferation of commercial launch rocket companies now, so that the cost per kilogram of putting something into orbit has fallen to the floor, right? It's opened a whole new market for commercial remote sensing companies, right? At least the ones that are focused on space-based sensors. But even if you look at drones and autonomy, we talked a lot about automatic vehicles driving, Tesla and the other ones, in terms of the software that they're building and the different types of sensors they're using with AI and machine learning to support, an autonomous vehicle. Like, all of this is happening in commercial industry. And now the result is you have a whole ecosystem of commercial data providers, right? You referenced Maxar. It was originally known as Digital Globe, and it was the first U.S. commercial satellite company that provided electro-optical high-resolution imagery. So high resolution being, sub 1 meter on Earth, ground sample distance. So 1 pixel, in the picture is equal to 1 meter on the Earth. The regulatory limit for that is 30 centimeters ground sample distance. So 1 pixel in the image equals approximately 30 centimeters on the Earth's surface. But now there's many players. Now what Digital Globe became Maxar through a series of acquisitions. There's Airbus, of course, in Europe, which is a whole consortium of different things and capabilities. There's Italian companies, there's Japanese companies, South Korean companies, Israelis companies, and then there's small sats. So there's a company here in San Francisco that put basically iPhones into space. So they have these satellites, the company's called Planet Labs, and their satellites are about the size of a shoebox. And they first launched them out of the International Space Station, like throwing them out, basically an airlock. But it's gotten much more sophisticated than that. Now they launch tranches of them on on commercial satellites, or sorry, commercial rocket launches like SpaceX. But what this does is, while the resolution it's medium resolution, so it's about 3 to 5 meters, per pixel in the image, in terms of ground sample distance on Earth. But the revisit rate, because they now have hundreds of these satellites in orbit, low Earth orbit, they can look at multiple, the same place on the Earth multiple times a day. Whereas, a big high resolution satellite, may only go over the same place on the Earth every few days. Or you can task it and direct it on orbit to do it more frequently, but on average, right, it's maybe seen the same place on Earth every 4 to 6 days.
So where is all that data that's being collected from different companies being stored in different places? Is it available to everybody? How's it gone through?
Yeah, so all of these companies have their own ground station architecture to bring the data down and process it and archive it or make it available to their customers. For the open source community, it's great because like Planet Labs, it has a do good for the world charter. In fact, I think it was even maybe incorporated as a B Corp. They open source their data frequently to nonprofits, NGOs, especially if there's a disaster, natural disaster or a major conflict in the world, they'll provide free access to their data. But these are, it takes a lot of money to build these sensors and operate them and manage the data coming from them. So most of them are for-profit entities, but there's the competitive landscape in the market has made the price points for this much more accessible. So, you have a whole swath now of the world that has access to Earth imaging or remote sensing imaging that didn't have access to it before because it was too expensive or because only governments had it and it was classified.
So now there's a lot of data that's available to the OSINT community. How do they get through it? How is AI helping, and is it expensive to get the right programs to sift through all that and get it to target what people are looking for?
I think it depends on the use case. Right? If you're looking at a very localized place, so let's say you're looking at a specific facility in a specific country, right? Especially the revisit, right? Let's say I only have an image every week. Well, now you might have for multiple different providers, multiple images a day, right? So that probably a single analyst could look at or process and analyze under themselves with a traditional, manual way of doing it. But when you start looking at, regions or provinces or states or countries or, a theater of operations or conflict, especially like if we look at the Ukraine, like what is the posture of the Russian forces? What are their supply lines? Like, so the supply chain and everything that is supporting those forces, how are they shifting? How are the Ukrainian forces and more importantly, population, like how are they being affected by it? And how are they being displaced or, what parts of their infrastructure can respond and support as, these huge refugee populations have been created and people are fleeing conflict. That, the data to answer those questions suddenly becomes, right, very ornery for a single analyst or a small team of analysts. So there are, one, like most of what data scientists are using are all open source tools. So like Apache Software Foundation tools, like the programming language Python has become very ubiquitous because it's easy to use and easy to learn. There's all sorts of libraries, right, that include the machine learning and statistics, the math and the AI, so that you can apply the data if you get access to it or have access to it more easily as someone who's not necessarily a fully trained data scientist.
Well, it's interesting that I think that I'm sort of skipping ahead, but that you were saying in that regard that the OSINT community, like there may evolve like a stack that would be, whatever, 15 different tools that everybody uses. And so now the OSINT community can say, okay, let's get this stack. We know we're going to at least have a foundation in X, Y, and Z, platforms. And but that's not yet developed, right? Everybody's using different stuff.
No, I've been at, my whole focus since 2011 is here in Silicon Valley, working with advanced analytics, AI, machine learning companies. And the data science teams that I work closely with, they're all using very similar tools. And these are similar tools that are being used across industry, like Google, which, when they had DeepMind, or OpenAI, Facebook or Meta, Amazon, their data science teams or AI machine learning teams are using a lot of the same common tools, a lot of which is open source. So, there's two trends. There's one, we have this open source community and these common tools. And what I was saying is, we're formalizing around, for data science practitioners, kind of a common stack of tools that someone would use, like Python libraries, Jupyter notebooks to be able to manage and present your information. And there's all sorts of, just like on Discord and all sorts of communities that you can sit and chat and collaborate and learn these things. Or like I'm currently getting a degree in data science at MIT, right? So you can get a formal degree program for these things too. But then there's the commercial companies, right? A lot of companies have commercialized this, right? So that they're providing enterprise software to enterprise, government, or commercial clients, because they've packaged and built these things into proprietary software that they can license to enterprise clients, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So how to what do you call it? Government's bad guys, the bad guys, they can get this stuff too. And so is it a race to see who can, who has more, who can access and process data?
Yes. So there's, just 1 second, I need a drink of water. There's definitely a technology race going on between the West and those that are opposed to Western ideals in democracy. Russia, excellent mathematicians, excellent engineers traditionally, right? So, but as we're finding out every day, poorly maintained infrastructure, poor ability to execute, complex operations. So, China is the real challenge, right? You have a now second largest country on earth by population. I think India just exceeded them, 1.4 billion to 1.3 billion. China is rapidly accelerated into, modern technology, modern cloud computing. Their research universities and their scientists and their students that are studying outside of China are deeply, learning and applying these types of technologies and bringing them back. It's part of their state policy. If you look at Chairman Xi's comments over the last several years in terms of the technical areas that they want to be global leaders in, by 2030, they have their, form of government is very top down, and they, the state controls everything, and they have sensors and law enforcement throughout the country, and all of that's collecting data, and it's all being processed, and their people are learning, right? So that is the key challenge, right? Between one way of approaching a problem and going up the learning curve versus the other, right? I would argue, though, the constraint and the benefit for Western democracies is the ethics that are applied to all of this, like liberal democratic ethics and values. As we start talking about artificial intelligence and computers and machines doing things that traditionally people have done, right? It's especially when we talk about the conduct of war and applying lethal force, right? That we need to, the West will, it's our commitment to do it in an ethical and moral way.
Which is actually formalized, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's been formalized for a long time. The Geneva Convention, right? There's whole, I believe Michael's an attorney, so there's a whole, cadre within the law in terms of just war, and unjust war, and there's UN charters and treaties. There's a whole international system and regulatory system in terms of what the ethical and legal prosecution of warfare is.
But as it relates to AI, haven't they had to update?
Yeah, AI is certainly challenging that. The U.S. is looking at it right now, and the EU as well. In terms of, it started with data and privacy rights with like GDPR in the EU. Protecting private citizens' information that commercial technology companies may have access to and that are using, and how they're using that. But as we start having AI being involved in processes and decisions that are part of each of our core lives daily, or in a wartime setting, whether the population lives or dies, like there definitely needs to be, clear guidelines and accepted norms of behavior around how to develop and apply that technology.
Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to talk to you a little bit more about Ukraine, and I think it's been like a sort of a laboratory for some of the AI that's going on. But I also wanted to mention, because all of us follow Oryx, of course, and his departure we've been thinking about. And so it was interesting to me when you said that you thought he would be somebody who would be in very high demand if he wanted a job.
Yeah, Oryx's work's been amazing, and I saw his announcement like everyone, and and so I applaud him for his work to date. It's been excellent work. But there's whole cadres of analytical people that work in each of our militaries and our governments that are doing this, right? In terms of one, what we call order of battle assessment, whether it's land order of battle, like how is the Russian army configured? Where are all the units? Where are their garrisons? Like how many of each type of vehicle and person is in each unit? Like what is their deployment status? And then there's battle damage assessment, what Oryx was doing. Like there's conflict and what systems are being taken off the battlefield or non-mission capable. So military analysts and intel analysts do this routinely.
Mm-hmm. And you were saying that people who can do this are in high demand. So I'm just putting the word out there to Oryx that you're in high demand.
Yes, definitely. Although with AI and machine learning, right? So AI and machine learning, at least those of us in the national security realm, it's not to replace the human subject matter expert. Like computers are not going to be able to replace an Oryx-like analyst that knows each of these systems and how they work and where they operate and what degrades them, right? You can't get a computer to think like that. What AI is helping is, looking at like all of Ukraine, like find me every T-72 in Ukraine. And then so Oryx can just sit down and literally look at every image of a T-72 in Ukraine for like the last 46 hours or 48 hours. Now, even that would be so much information that one person couldn't do it. So find me the damaged ones or the ones that haven't moved in, more than 2 to 4 hours, and just focus on that. So helping the analyst bound the problem to have a smaller set of data to actually apply their human subject matter expertise to answer the analytical question. So teasing the signal from the noise.
Yeah, I like that expression. I think Michael has a couple things to ask you.
Sure. Thanks very much, Kitty. It's been an interesting conversation so far.
Michael, I'm sorry, your mic is.
Sure, I'll just be 1 second.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so Chris, just while he fixes that, it's interesting that not all of what that we're using is AI, that a lot of it is machine learning and things like the Patriot and some of the other.
Yeah, so I think that, AI is getting a lot of buzz, like cloud computing was or whatever. And I think it's important to understand what AI is and what machine learning is. Machine learning is a subset of AI and is kind of the pathway to AI. But AI is developing integrated computer systems or robotic systems to mimic what's traditionally been human behavior, right? And to take action in the absence of a human on certain things. So I think like an autonomous vehicle like Tesla's automated driving capability is a perfect example of that. It's not just the software, it's the hardware, right? The car, the vehicle, all the sensors, which are hundreds in the car, like going into a processor and the software running it, that it takes that level of technical sophistication to get near or nearer to what an experienced human driver, adult driver could do, right?
Wow, that's cool. So cool.
Thanks very much for that. Sorry, every so often my mic develops a bit of an error and I have to reset it. I'll just remind the audience that Chris was super helpful in advance of our conversation in providing background material, reading material. So if you have a look in the nest, there are a good dozen or so references to many of the things that we covered, including the history of development of AI programs in the U.S. government, and then the role that Ukraine is playing in its application, and some issues on ethics and control of AI. So it's all up there for background reading. So Chris, my questions relate to the idea, you've been highlighting that a lot of this, these tools can be applied to open source intelligence. But when you're discussing open source intelligence, we tend to think of it more as what some of the interesting people here on Twitter are doing, including some groups that are working together. But of course, what you're talking about tends to be either open source intelligence as being carried out by the government or potentially by pretty sophisticated commercial groups is what I get the sense of. And so what I would be curious of your opinion on is, what's the role for more of the hobbyist, like the OSINT type folks we see here on Twitter, to get into this? Do you foresee sort of hobbyists actually going out and developing the ability to handle much larger amounts of imagery than they do now and sort of process things in bulk? Or do you think it's more of a recruiting pool for the organizations who want to draw people who can develop those skills?
Yeah, so like you noted, there's a spectrum of open source intelligence practitioners, right? It was the government to augment their classified intelligence collection and analysis, and then there's a commercial industry that's grown up, to, I'd say mainly to support other commercial clients, and then NGOs and nonprofits, given their level of funding and staffing, has increased their sophistication. But there's social media and the rapid diffusion of information. It means we have this massively, rapidly growing and expansive group like that's here this evening, right? They're curious, they're motivated, they're already devoting time to it to learn and apply those learnings, right, to understand what the truth is and to deliver, credible and disciplined analytical insights to whatever communities that we're part of and what we support. So I guess the key point is there's a space in that spectrum for everyone, and this segment in terms of like a single open source intelligence practitioner or hobbyist, as you said, working by themselves or in a small group now, right, because of the tools to help you better curate and manage and analyze information are now readily available. They're free. There's whole communities around helping you understand how to use them. And so I think it's really the level of time that the hobbyist or practitioner is willing to spend and how motivated they are to look at more data to answer the problem or the question. And maybe they're motivated to answer the question and they're realizing they need to review more and infinitely more data to answer it effectively, and that will motivate them to look at some of these tools and learn how to use these tools to help them. Does that answer your question?
It does. It leads to the next thought, which is that I know some of the people who have great understanding and context, whether it's knowledge of equipment systems or communication radar systems or military strategy informations, they can look at the imagery and draw some very insightful conclusions from it. But that several of the people who are already doing that are highlighting, I do this work, it is expensive to get these satellite imagery. If you can support my work, please do. And it strikes me that none of the people that I'm aware of who are doing it, on a small group basis, that they're all cost constrained in access to the imagery itself. And therefore they just don't have, it's not an option to be processing things on a mass scale in the way that you're describing. Do you see that changing at all? I know you talked about the competition among satellite and imagery providers. Do you see that becoming more affordable for the small team that we have here on Twitter?
Yeah, so I think there's two angles, right? One, like to look at like battle damage assessment of military vehicles, you need high resolution imagery, right? So, to actually see damage on the vehicle specifically. So that's the most expensive form of imagery. And so I'd say there's two ways or opportunities to address the issue to getting more access to that type of data. Like one is there's some firms out there, like Planet Labs actually has high resolution SkySats. They're about 50 to 70 centimeters grand sample distance. And because of Planet Labs' charter and mandate, they do philanthropic things where they donate data, right? So I'd say there are firms out there, like ICEYE is a Finnish synthetic aperture radar satellite company, right? Being from Finland and the EU, like they're also not just looking at profit, but they're looking at helping the forces of good, and they might consider low cost or no cost data sharing. So, I mean, we'd have to have a separate conversation to like handicap which of the companies would be more amenable to that, and maybe we can take that offline. The other solution is a little bit of collectivism, right? If you look at Bellingcat, or there's been some self-organization, and once they're organized and they're formal, they can go to these companies and say, hey, we're a nonprofit and this is what we do, and your data would be really critical to help our work. Like, could you give us access to it at a low cost or no cost, right? So I would suggest that doesn't need to be the traditional barrier that it's been in the past.
Well, that's very interesting, and I know we have several hands up. Just to those waiting, two more questions of mine, which will probably be quick. One is that given the increasing recognition of the power that these tools represent, I wonder whether we're living in a little bit of a Wild West, or maybe from an OSINT practitioner's view, a golden age. Are you at all concerned that we're going to see additional regulation on access to some of this commercial data as its power becomes more widely known? Or do you think there will be a general acceptance in Western countries of just openness on this front?
I think it's going to be the latter, because it's only increased transparency, right? If you look going back to Twitter and the Arab Spring, and so one of the counterpoints of regulating social media has been, well, the free flow of ideas and dialogue, especially cross borders and political systems and cultures, is good, right? So I think while there's definitely some privacy concerns around all of these sensors that are around us every day that many of us aren't aware of, I think at least in terms of Earth imaging, remote sensing, I think that's going to be protected from regulation, minimizing access, because it's increasing transparency, especially around parts of the world that are more closed off than others, right? In terms of Iran, North Korea, China, Russia, right? It allows communities like this that are curious and motivated to learn more and investigate. It gives them the ability to do so and then collaborate with others. Does that answer your question?
It does, and I'm glad that you're so positive in your outlook. I certainly hope that from the investigator's perspective, that idea of transparency continues to be the one that predominates. But so my last question, and perhaps this is something that you and I can take offline. You gave the example of the data science. I know you're doing your master's in data science, but you gave the example of the MIT link. So if you look at the first item in the nest to the audience, Chris has identified what he says is an excellent program that can be directly applied to OSINT. And there's a link to an MIT program there. But, you referred to Discord servers and communities to learn these tools. It would be great to work with you to identify some of those a little bit more specifically, because as much as I've been paying attention to this for the last year or so, I just never have delved into the more technical side of learning the GIS, sort of more advanced Python and so on. So it would be great to develop that as a resource, or perhaps it already has been laid out and you can just point me to it. But hopefully we can connect on that.
Yeah, I could. I'm happy to work with you and Riverside Kitty and to share with the group too. There's a whole list of good programs, some of which are free or open source, right? So you don't have to pay for it. Yeah, we could go through all of that so that the people that are curious or want to learn more or dig into it, you kind of have a vetted list of a good place to start.
Perfect. And I'll, keep an eye on my profile. So after we get that put together, I'll make sure I tweet it out, and I'll probably identify it to the audience during our next conversation. So I know there are several hands up. I'm going to go to Exit first as co-host, and then I believe it was Aaron first after that. So go ahead, Exit.
So my question is kind of the opposite. Is AI moving so fast that it's worth just waiting a year or two instead of investing the time to learn things like basic coding and things like that?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So the part of AI that I've been focused on, right, there's a whole field and there's a bunch of different segments. And the one that's been dominating all of the news recently with ChatGPT and generative AI and large language models, that is a whole different field than what I'm talking about, which is mostly computer vision and, right, applying computer vision to image-based data inputs, or something that has a geo-coordinate in it, right? It could be structured data as well. So I would say, if you're interested in being able to help bring analytical tools to your toolkit, analyst toolkit, to be able to analyze data more quickly, or analyze and correlate, of course, but also at a broader scale for harder or more complex problems. I'd encourage you to look into it. And you don't have to dive down a rabbit hole. There's different levels of knowledge that you can pursue, right? So it's kind of like, what's most important to you? What do you want to optimize your time on? What's the reward for time invested, and how does it fold back into what you're doing? If that makes sense.
So thanks for that. We'll try and work our way through all the hands. Chris, we've been chatting for about 45 minutes, so you just let us know if you have any time constraints, and we'll.
Good. The questions, the Q&A is the best part, right? That's why We're all here.
Well, in that case, if anybody who's listening who hasn't come up has any questions, feel free to request the mic. We'll bring you up. So I think it was Aaron Bilcock first, and then Aaron Bouma. Go ahead, Mr. Bilcock.
Thanks, Michael. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
I hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I've got a friend who works in defence here in Australia, and like you said, he's using Python. I've got a son who's coming of age. Would you think that Python? I've got another friend who's a professor, and he's really pushing Python for economics, because he thinks that economists should have a universal language that they all communicate in, and it isn't licensed. So you don't have to pay a license for it, whereas some of the economic languages are. Therefore, this language opens it up with AI and everything for third world countries, and everything can be sort of added and improved on, a little bit like Linux. Would you say this is the language that's sort of solidified itself for AI, and that will be the language going forward for a long period of time, and therefore any investment that you put now would be fairly safe if you're going to learn that language? And just as far as it being open source and so forth, does that allow Russia and a lot of other countries to use our openness to progress themselves? But is our progression just going to be that much faster because we're an open society? Anyway, a bit open-ended. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I would say, Python has matured to the point where those of us that are focused on data science, analytics, and AI and machine learning are all using Python. So it having learned C++ first at uni, and then Java, right, early in my career, Python is so much easier to learn and use, right? It's almost like you just type what you want the computer to do and it does it. And then you reference a bunch of libraries to actually do all the work, right? So people have curated these libraries, and you say, run, square means analysis on this, and it just does it, right? So it's kind of plug and play and easy to use, easy to learn. There's a whole global community out there supporting it too. So like all the documentation, and there's all sorts of local, regional, groups to help you and ask questions. It's regulated too. So there's a board, like to your second question. Yeah, it's a global open community. So there is risk that bad actors could try to act within that community, but it has a self-governance system, right, where the people that have been invested in it a long time are regulating how people are using it and how it's managed and how it's developed. So I would say the risk is lower than it could be because of that, with respect to bad actors. And of course, if you're running the programs on your own computer or computers that you control that are updated and are secure, then the risk of foreign actors looking into what you're doing is low or lower. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. My friend was just working on drone swarms, and he was saying that all the research and development R&D for his military company is all on drones now. But the drone swarm has its own AI, so they'll work. But he's working out how to take one out. It's very hard to remove one from if it goes wrong. But you answered my question. Thank you.
Yeah, edge computing is a little bit different, right? So the drawback to Python is at runtime it runs slower than say C++. So it depends on the use case. Like for the edge and the what you just talked about, the use case of a drone swarm communicating with one another and dynamically adapting, right, to what they're doing, you might need a different language for like in that architecture, right, for the runtime on the processors on the edge devices to go very quickly. So it's a little bit different than Python, but Python for the economics and math and AI and machine learning, at least for the core system and functions and building the models, like the actual trained algorithms that you then would deploy into like the drone swarm architecture, that's all being done in Python cloud computing environment.
Okay,
great, thank you.
Great. So I think it was Aaron Bouma and then Wolverine. Go ahead, Aaron.
Hi, Chris. It's good to hear your voice again. Good to see you again in the spaces. You've been great chatting on the Baum Report and everything in the past, and thanks a million. My question to you is, do you think that, because we know that China is watching the Russian failures and they're learning from the Russian failures because they have, for years, they've been adapting Russian tactics and whatnot for their army and onward. And we see them adapting to things. And we see they're definitely watching the Ukrainians and what we've taught them. They're watching the successes and the failures in that as well. Do you think that how closely do you think that they're watching the AI tactics? Because I think that that's a real concern that we're going to be seeing if we are in a conflict with them in the next 20 years. How serious of a threat do you think that the Chinese AI is going to be in the future? And thanks a million, guys. I'm Aaron Bouma, host of the Baum Report, military and OSINT space.
Yeah, Aaron, it's great to see you here, and I've enjoyed your spaces, and great to hear your voice. Excellent question. Right, so yes, emphatic yes, that our adversaries are watching what's going on in the Ukraine. Right, there's a new way of fighting that's happening there. You could argue, I think Riverside Kitty and I had shared an article in the Nest. The Ukraine's become kind of a modern laboratory for how we want to fight in the future, or how we're going to need to fight in the future with how warfare is evolving with technology. With China specifically, this is an area that they're investing immensely, like across like a whole of nation effort in terms of all of their infrastructure investment, their academic and research investments, their military and defense investments. If you go back to the seminal, Chinese War College paper I think it was written in 92 or 94 by two superior colonels, right? It's all about asymmetric warfare. Like short of fighting a land war in China, like they know that like if we were to engage in kinetic conflict, that the way to defeat us is through asymmetric means. Right. AI is definitely seen as a way, like contributing to asymmetric warfare. A more like one way I'm interested in it is how are Eastern philosophies and Eastern engineers going to train their AI versus Western liberal democracies? Like that hasn't fully played out yet. but it's an interesting, I don't know, I'll put a note to kind of think more about that. But, there could be blind spots like us in the West as we look at how, like, even you could argue the Ukraine, a modern conflict in the EU, which is crazy in the 21st century, given what we've all been through. We're still fighting, it's actually kind of crazy looking at it's like trench warfare. It's like we're back to like the First Great War, the end all wars. I mean, you could just say we're using more lethal modern systems, right? But which is horrible for those that are engaged in conflict. But in the future conflict, like vis-a-vis China and everything, it's going to be, it's a real threat. We should be wary of it, and we need to make sure we don't have any blind spots in terms of how they're developing and advancing their capabilities. Does that answer your question?
I'm going to assume that it does. I think it was a great answer.
Yes, it does. It does. Thanks.
So we had Wolverine next, followed by Par. Go ahead, Wolverine.
So I did miss a little bit of it, but I know that you were talking about magnification, I guess, in regards to like recovered vehicles. How was magnification, or how much were you guys able actually to tell, like when you're looking at like battle damaged vehicles?
So I think, Wolverine, you're referring to Chris's statement about how the use case that needs the highest resolution imagery is battle damage assessment. So is your question sort of about how high resolution that needs to be?
Yes, pretty much. Because, like I said, like I told a lot of people, that was one of the things I did during the war in 2003. We do battle damage vehicle recovery and battle damage vehicle assessments and repairs and stuff like that. So yeah, that's what I was asking.
Yeah. So typically, like, I mean, this goes back to like Roman times and the length of an axle on a road, right? So the length, like in tanks and military vehicles, are little bit wider, but in general, right, it's like a meter of distance or more, or even less for smaller vehicles. So you're going to need ground sample distance resolution imagery of a meter or less. But like, especially if you're looking at point penetrations on armor or things like that, you're going to need sub-meter imagery. So high resolution. But there's we could have a whole other conversation on the proliferation of commercial remote sensing data. And, there's now weather balloons, and I have not referencing the Chinese spy balloon, right? There's Worldview. They launch weather balloons out of like the Phoenix airport. There's no regulatory limit on the resolution of aerial based unmanned sensors. So they can get down to like a centimeter, 2 centimeters of ground sample distance, right? And this is commercial unmanned aerial imagery.
Right, and it may have been part of my bias that when we've been talking about imagery, I've been primarily thinking about satellite imagery. But of course, many of the data management and sort of AI, the basic steps of analysis that you've been talking about are just as applicable to, for example, battle damage assessment of ground photographs, like the sort that are collected from social media platforms and so on. So just because we've been speaking a lot about satellites doesn't mean that the other part of the analytical chain can't be applied to other sources of imagery.
Yeah, 100%. Like, in fact, for this community, I'd say that the ground, people taking photos with their phones or getting access to like live stream cameras or security cameras, huge value. And that's higher resolution than, most satellites.
Right. Okay, I think it was Par and then Dara. Go ahead, Par.
Yeah, hi, Chris. I'm Jason. I mostly have a background in cybersecurity. I just wanted to wondered if you would recommend to power users to use like TensorFlow and set up neural networks and keep a data lake of import to a data lake any of the information they'd like to work on to search out with Python, because anyone could be a budding data scientist and we just don't know yet. So anyone can do this. And in fact, most places I've worked, there's actually a playbook for, setting up everything new. So, there are manuals. I will try to find some, I'll collect some so that we can distribute them.
Yeah, So, I've done 2 cybersecurity companies and focused a lot on that in my career too. It's great to meet another practitioner, and thanks, for highlighting the question. Like, with regard to the architecture and data lakes and everything. So for flowing data, like for structured flowing log data, like cybersecurity, a data lake is essential, right? You need to have all of the different sensor flows coming into a common data repository that modern tools can use to reference super quickly, like you, the user, being able to do sub-second queries against like millions, or billions of rows of data.
Right. It's mostly it's about data I/O, because it's about having storage. I mean, the compute power, Python's threading is pretty good. The compute power is very low, and it's more disk I/O and everything.
Exactly. So the way you would apply the Python stuff to it, right, is to train the models, with the packages in Python. And I'm talking about this as like you being you practitioner versus being, a full stack engineer at an enterprise cybersecurity company, right? But like you said, these tools are ubiquitous. It's great to see, like, my old employer, Microsoft, has dedicated hundreds of millions of dollars to filling the gaps. I mean, we have, I think it's close to 1 million jobs like deficit in the cybersecurity industry right now. They're working with community colleges, full universities. They're trying to train the next generation, and it's all for free, right? And they have all of these. It's not just Microsoft. Google, like today, I think it was $40 million that they're putting into free cybersecurity talent training systems. Like if you're interested in cyber, that is a massive and rapidly growing industry, and the technology is super interesting and fascinating, and they're really hard problems to solve.
Right, and it's honestly, most people, it's not expensive to build one yourself. You just need, a lot of good disk storage and a decent computer. Just anybody can really do it, especially if we get some manuals together and get people started on it.
Yeah, even, one way I'm doing it at home, or trying to, is I've been very adverse to having kind of smart home technology, because it's a hot mic in your house and a bunch of stuff that's collecting data on you and sharing it with commercial third parties because your end user agreement you accepted because it's free, right? So, but to your point, you can set up your own home network with these same tools that enterprise companies are using, and create your own server and be able to put your own firewall up. And so you could leverage new smart technology with privacy in your home. Like, that's just one use case of how you could take the enterprise tools, right, that the leading companies are using, and apply it to yourself as a cyber practitioner, or in whatever your sphere of things that you want to focus on is.
Right. I mean, I think people could just learn how to teach TensorFlow or something, Once you get that done, then they can, hone in on what the data is that they want to look at.
Yeah, for those that may not know what TensorFlow is, like, that's Google's, let's say, package or portfolio of tools that they use that is optimized for their hardware in their cloud. So they have tensor processing units, TPUs, like, which are optimized for AI and machine learning stuff. And then they have a whole software suite that's packaged in TensorFlow. And I believe that's open source, right? So And there's a lot of good use. We use TensorFlow for certain things. And so like that would be definitely in the stack of stuff, right? A lot of it is the type of data that you're like, cyber versus imagery data, right? There's static imagery data, a satellite image. There's full motion video, which is a stream of images, depending on how many frames per second it is. And then there's cyber data, which is, log data. All this telemetry data is, millions of rows a second, like flowing through these networks, right? So depending on the type of data and the velocity and scale of that data, you're going to use different architecture and different tools.
Exit, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah. So I'm going to ask the big elephant in the room question. What's the downside to AI?
So I think I'd echo a lot of the more leading voices in industry. Like, technology is intended to support humans and make humans' lives better, right? So we need to make sure, the companies I work for, it's to empower the human and help them be better at what they are good at doing, right? I think that's where we need to bound the effort. Like, we can't let things become unconstrained so that we diminish the centricity of supporting the human and letting the human maintain ultimate control over that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it absolutely does. Thank you. I appreciate that. There's so many amazing things that I think that we can do with AI, and I'm excited about that. I played with it myself last night trying to write some Google Docs. And I'm just cautious of the idea that we take so many people out of the path that we lose the ability to make those ethical decisions on a regular basis. And sometimes it's easy to do that when you aren't in contact with the data in the same way that you might have been kind of doing it, quote unquote, the old school way.
Yeah, I agree with your concerns 100%. And I think in any first-class software development organization, you need to be literally shoulder to shoulder with your intended users and know exactly what their minute to minute is on the use case of which you're trying to empower and support. So that's the way I solve the problem. There's of course a whole regulatory discussion. I think the EU is way out in front in a good way. So I'm tracking all of these, like, starting with the GDPR and Schrems 1, Schrems 2 for data privacy, but that's now extending as AI is maturing or, in its nascent phase of becoming more ubiquitously available. So I'm optimistic. Like, if we keep humans central to technology, then I think we solve this problem.
Which is a question often brought up more in connection with, when AI is making decisions. But there's also, of course, the more generic danger that the bigger a black box you build, the more investment there is in any one person understanding how the whole flow works, and that you can just lose insight into the process. Like, it allows you to do it at scale, but it may also mean that people lose some of the context that's critical to the analysis. We've had one or two more speakers come up, so we'll go through a few more hands. I'm conscious that we've had Chris chatting with us for quite a while, so I don't want to wear on him too much. I just wanted to highlight how interesting it is to me that we've had speakers come up from such a variety of backgrounds, including people who have done, battle damage analysis firsthand, we've had, computer science academics, computer science practitioners, just the interested amateur has been represented as well. So this is partly why I like holding these spaces, is the ability to bring together people from such a wide variety of backgrounds. Because I know we have, for example, listeners who work with sort of the Oryx war spotting team. I know we have some listeners from the GeoConfirm team. And so I think there's lots of great applicability there. And of course, my particular angle of interest is more on the sort of management organization side that Chris pointed out, of how do you bring sort of amateurs together in a way that they can act more collectively and sort of interact with these groups that have, some of the more powerful tools or data sets. How do you get people to all be working toward a more sophisticated goal than you can accomplish individually? So I think we maybe have two more hands up for questions for Chris. I'm going to go to Kitty as co-host, and then we'll go to Heliana. Go ahead, Kitty.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that we had a note from a listener who says that they have been working on this for 12 months and they're going to send you a list.
Well, whether that's a list coming to me or to Chris, either way is great. I would encourage those who have heard this conversation and are enjoying it to reach out to Chris, because building collaboration is a big part of what I'm hoping to do here. So Heliana, I think you may have the last question for Chris.
I think Toshi may have been before me.
So we coordinate in the background here. So I think Toshi has a question for when we move on after this topic.
Okay, awesome. So I apologize that I haven't been able to be listening this whole time. But have you guys touched on the topic of or two topics, like hallucination by AI and the interview, so-called, by a reporter with ChatGPT? I don't know if it was 3.5 or 4.0. I don't know, but he got into the position where the generative AI was telling him that he needed to leave his wife because he wasn't happy with her and that kind of thing. Have you guys touched on any of that kind of thing?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So what you raised, what we've been focused on mostly, or at least my comments have been focused on a separate field of AI and machine learning that is not what we would call your generative AI, right? So using computer vision or machine learning to look at remote sensing imagery to support OSINT intelligence. So, but like to follow up from one of the previous comments, right, in the ethics of and morals of AI, like what you just described is a lot of the pitfalls and risks to unregulated generative AI, right? So the hallucinations, right? You're asking an algorithm, right, that's kind of in a black box. I think GPT-5 has over 1 trillion parameters, right? So, like, what are those trillion parameters? Like, what biases do the parameters have? Like, how you ask ChatGPT a question, like, increases its value to you as the person posing the question, and the sequence of those questions, right, as a large language model, right, it's predicting the next word you type in the question context and then already building the answer to it based upon those trillion data points, like the visible internet that it crawled, the internet before September 2021. So we haven't focused as much on generative AI, but you bring up, these are the key points in our field right now. Like, what risks and does, deep fakes, like, people, heads of state, Putin, if someone were to use generative AI to mimic some type of policy pronouncement or right, like that, that could shift the way actors around the world act if it's not understood very quickly that it's not really him or it's not true. So yeah, again, the generative AI space has taken almost all the headlines in the last several months. But I just want to reinforce that AI is a huge field. That's a very specific segment of it in terms of generative AI and large language models versus a lot of what I've been talking about tonight, which is a different field and segment of it, if that makes sense.
I'll go back and listen to what you've been talking about. Thank you so much.
Yeah, criminals use it now, like the African prince, the 419ers in Nigeria. They write in perfect English using it. So that's how it's, with the cybercrime has changed things. And this is right now as we're, going through the present, it's happening.
Yeah, the cyber risk is brutal, right? Like, let's say I want to hack a Wi-Fi hotspot in a Starbucks, so I can skim everyone's privacy data off their laptops that's connected to it. You can go right into ChatGPT and say, show me the code I need to write to hack the Wi-Fi router to get admin access to it and get in the loop of all the, these are huge ethical and moral questions, and which is why the regulatory landscape you've seen accelerate, right, to put some initial regulatory guidelines and boundaries around this.
Well, can I make one really quick comment on that specific point? On something I listened to today, I think on NPR, they were equating nuclear regulation to AI regulation, and that we are really behind on AI.
Well, it is. Go ahead.
You're the attorney and the host, so I defer to you, Michael.
Sure. Well, yep. I mean, I've heard proposals that sort of like the nuclear test ban treaty, there should be limits on it, and there's a broad discussion going on about imposing some kind of brakes on the rate of research. I was only going to come in and say that it is such a huge field that maybe what we'll just have to do is invite Chris to come back and join us again in a couple of weeks. And we can touch on some of the things we only referred to today. We had one speaker asking about managing drone swarms. We could, for example, try and get Chris or others together with people like our friend Sam Bendett to sort of have the AI and the drone sides coming together. There's lots of options to delve into the subject further. But I think that may be it for hands on this issue. So I'll say a big thank you to Chris. Thanks very much for joining us tonight. And I do hope that a couple of people in our audience who can find ways to work with you, reach out to you. And I know I certainly will, to follow up on developing some, presentation of sources where people can go and learn more if they want to start coming up the knowledge curve on these matters. So thanks very much, Chris.
Yeah, no, thank you for your interest and your invitation and giving me the opportunity to interact with your community. And I'm here to help. So anyone, please feel free to reach out to me. And happy to collaborate with you, Michael, and your team.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you.
Yeah, that's terrific, because I mean, it always does surprise me at how possible it is to meet honest to God experts here on Twitter and interact with them with your questions. So I think that's one of the amazing dynamics of Twitter Spaces and why I like holding these conversations here. Okay, so we will move into updates from Ukraine. I'll start putting some material up from sort of my agenda. I know that our friend Toshi has been waiting patiently. And for those who don't know, Toshi is essentially our correspondent in Japan. And so he probably is busy. I'm not even sure what time it would be there. It would probably be early morning there. But I know he has an issue he wanted to raise about the Japanese connection to the war. So Toshi, why don't you go ahead?
Oh, thank you. In Japan, it's almost 12 o'clock in the noon, and so I'm so glad to speak, Mr. Bond, in space. Okay. I would like to share this information about the second-hand fighter jet engine to Ukraine. I already post in space. So it is written in Japanese. MSN uploaded almost 1 or 2 weeks ago. So in Japanese, F-15 is Japanese self-defense force. Almost totally the 250 F-15 is equipped in Japan. I would like to say Japan Air Force. So, but the early F-15 we call the almost the F-15J. It is almost the same as the F-15C is a USAF. Of course, it's a little different, but the early product of the F-15 in Japan, Mitsubishi Heavy Industry. So it is too old for, in other words, it is too much cost for the upgrading to latest F-15. Sorry, I forget the latest F-15 in the USAF model. So, but in other words, the early type of the F-15J is same equipped engine of the F-16A and B. F-100 Pratt & Whitney is same model. It made in the IHI Japanese company. So it is able to use in second parts as a second engine for Ukrainian Air Force F-16. And it already the news report is said the Japanese government to sending to these engines to Indonesia. I'm sorry, I don't know the correct pronunciation.
You had it right, Toshi.
Yes, and so it is in history. I would like to point out in Taiwan in almost 1970 or 1980, F-104 starfighters is it was equipped in Japan Air Force, and it was sending to the Taiwan Air Force via United States as FMS. I'm sorry, I forget the correct word. FMS return for the United States government. So maybe this is a political trick. And how do you think? Is it possible, or I'm daydreaming? So maybe Japanese government and the United States government and the Ukrainian government is talking about this matter. Maybe so. I would like to hear about everybody's impression or questions. Thank you.
Well, we discussed a week ago the big news about the changes to the Japanese law that enable more export of weapon systems. So that was a significant development. The one I hadn't heard about the idea of exporting F-15 engines. There had been some discussion about the possibility that Japan may be willing to transfer a significant number of artillery shells to the United States in order to assist Ukraine, which was very promising. Maybe my question to you, Toshi, if I heard you right, were you saying that F-15 engines can be used in F-16s? I don't know a lot about aircraft, but I wasn't aware that that was the case.
Yes, and in the F-15 and F-16 is the same product. Is also the common engine in the F-100 PW, Pratt & Whitney 100 type equipped in especially in RE-A, F-15A and F-16A is they are use a common engine and for the reduce the cost for the equipment. So, and I think the RE type of the model is there are not so big different. Of course, it's a little changing or a little setting is a changed, almost the same, almost as used, able to use to the F-16 for especially in F-16A and B. So I think in of course it is many of the maybe aircraft maintenance engineers say, please don't say such a daydreaming. It is too hard. But basically, same engine is using in the F-16 and F-15. Of course, the latest type is F-110 engine used, and the PW Pratt & Whitney's engine is it had many of the trouble in the early time, but they are fixing to the after the fixing to the engines. So and also this is I say to the political trick is the aircraft is a weapon, but what is parts? Is a weapon or not? It is a trick.
Yeah, I hear you. That's a good point. And so, of course, you're right. I looked it up just to confirm that the P100 was used in the early models of both the F-15 and F-16. I suppose that may come down to if F-16s are provided to Ukraine, whether they would be provided with those same early models. But that's a very interesting opportunity that I hadn't been aware of. So thanks for bringing that to our attention. I think Wolverine may have come up with a question, though. Wolverine, do you want to go ahead?
It's more just a statement on kind of what you're saying. So it was actually used on some of the older ones, but it is that the engine, which is the Pratt & Whitney F100 or JTF22 for them, was also actually used on the F-15 Strike Eagle, F-15E Echo Strike Eagles. And then from there, it developed into the PW 220-220E, which is installed later on. But they've got like 6 or 7 different. It looks like about 6 or different engines that actually came off that initial one and were subsequently used in both of those aircraft up till it looks like the F100 PW 220-220E, and then they also had the F100 PW 200, which also came off of that. So yeah, they do actually use the same power plants in both of those. The only one you'd have to look it up is that here we go. So the PW229 powers late model F-16C and D Block 52s and F-15Es, and the Block C and D Block 52s are basically they're not the most current, up to date, but those are actually way better than the original engine, the original F-100s that they had installed on them.
Okay, well, thanks for that additional context, Wolverine. And so, once again, just thanks to Toshi for highlighting to us this possibility. And it's nice to see that Japan is coming around on the idea of weapons provision, both whether under their legal changes or whether, as Toshi suggests, some items are transferred more as spare parts because it's more politically acceptable. I'm going to jump into going through updates. And so I'm starting in the, if you have a look at the agenda, which again, if you go all the way to the right and you click on the invite to this space, you can open up the speaking notes, the agenda. And I'm starting on updates on the offensive. Just a reminder that our space isn't necessarily a breaking news space. So when I cover the offensive, I'm going to be highlighting some of the critical developments. Often they're a day or two old, and some analysis that helps us try to understand what's likely to happen next. So it's not as focused on what's happened in the last hours. To that end, if you have a look at, so Toshi's put his item in the nest first, but if you start looking at the second item in the nest, there's a tweet from the account Ukraine Reporter. And sort of the theme I want to start with is highlighting the fact that it seems like Russia has been launching many counterattacks in attempts to retake positions as Ukraine has taken them. And that for the most part, those counterattacks have been very unsuccessful. And it may be anecdotal, but it's seeming like a lot of the losses that Russia has been sustaining are not losses of units that are in fixed defensive positions, but in fact, equipment that's being used in counterattacking. And so if you have a look at that thread by the Ukraine Reporter account, it makes the good point that it may be that at this point of the offensive, Ukraine isn't actually as focused on the capture of territory, but rather trying to exhaust the Russians, by succeeding in, creating more attrition in the Russian forces than the Ukrainians are sustaining themselves, with the idea that if they can fight a more intense battle up front on circumstances that are favorable to them, that by wearing down the Russian reserves, that it will make it much easier to make a breakthrough down the road. So that's, the analysis I'm seeing going around that seems to make a lot of sense to me, but perhaps that might motivate others to put forward their opinions. And so there's one other tweet I'll put up again in a moment, but it's there's another term that's going around in analysis as a tactic the Ukrainians seem to be employing, and I think it dates back to World War II, called the bite and hold tactic, with the idea being that Ukraine may be trying to seize very small portions of territory at a time, rather than having big maneuver efforts all at once. And in that way, they're essentially goading the Russians to say, we've just taken your territory, what are you going to do about it? And the Russians are taking the bait by responding with these counterattacks that are being fairly costly. I'll pause for a moment. A couple of hands have gone up. I'll go to Dean and then we'll go to John. Go ahead, Dean.
Okay, is mic check first? Is it loud and clear?
Loud and clear.
Great. Oh, by the way, my brother is in the insurance business, and he's going to follow up and send me some stuff on the on underwriting, which there's some interesting things regarding maritime trade, and so he's going to dig up, and I will send you a copy of that. But regarding Japan, I have a question as a journalist, and I'm really curious about the northern islands that are still the northern Japanese territory that is still under Russian occupation, and to what extent is that possibly influencing Japan's inclination to be supportive of Ukraine? Toshi, do you have any comments on that?
So that's a great question. I'll just let you know, Dean, that Toshi has stepped down as speaker at this point.
Okay.
But we'll definitely send it to him, and if he rejoins us, maybe we'll come back to it. Otherwise, we'll try and get him to speak to it in a future space, because I know he enjoys adding his analysis in.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. So we'll come back around to that in a bit. But John, go ahead.
Thanks for having me up here. It's good to see everyone, especially Cameron as well. Haven't seen you in a while. I was going to speak on the Ukrainian tactics, or some of the supposed Ukrainian tactics being used during these counteroffensives and the counteroffensives of the Russians. I think we're seeing multiple different types of tactics depending on what suits them best, depending on which AOR they are in. And I think one tactic we are seeing a lot is something that kind of dates back to like the Mongols and the Parthians, which is, this idea of kind of goading them into attacking by either feigning an attack or attacking, making breakthroughs and penetrating, and then withdrawing once losses are incurred. It's essentially a feigned retreat, and then if you were on a horse at the time, right, you'd wheel back around and hit them once they've kind of exposed their forces, which we see the Russians doing. They tend to get goaded into false retreats very, very much. But I think this thing that you mentioned, bite and hold, is essentially what I would call consolidation in gains, right? So they take a small area of they make a small gain, they consolidate that heavily, and then make it very costly for the Russians to take it back if they can at all. So that's just a quick input I would give on that.
Thanks for that. And I see Cameron is keen to come in. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, when they're building these defensive fortifications and moving these supply lines up, I think the slower you do it, the more you can fortify your rear. So you don't always want to be too ambitious. There's a chance you could throw all your offensive capacity at a single area and push through a lot further than you otherwise would. But it's not really useful if you can only hold it until a counterattack happens. So I think there's definitely some of that at play. I'm not sure there was enough breaching equipment and stuff like that sent. And I think it would be a little bit better if they had more artillery and fires capability. They're having to do this with still a substantial amount of rounds. But they really probably want to up that to go on an offensive tempo, and I'm sure they are, but they still have limited capacity compared to what they'd like. But I do think that is a very big part of it. And then later in the space, I have some announcements in terms of ammo production.
Perfect. Well, yeah, I know you've been working on that for a while, so we'll hopefully work through to the equipment section in, maybe 10, 15 minutes. I know hands are up. We'll go to those in a moment. I'll just work through two more posts in the nest. So looking at the third and fourth items back, despite this sense of a slower progress in territorial gain, I do note that the Ukrainians are now nearing some regions that are more strategically significant. And so the third item back in the nest highlights that with the capture of the village of Piatikatki, that the Ukrainians are essentially just down the highway from the town of Vasilivka, which is sort of an entry point to a very fortified region. You'll see the triangle in that graphic in the tweet from Roman Moschek. And so that battle for Vasilivka will be one to definitely keep an eye on, right by the Dnieper River. Also, there were reports in the last day or so of the Ukrainians potentially making some significant advances near Robotny, which is just to the east of the area in this tweet, which is great news because breakthroughs there could allow some more rapid territorial gains, provided that is consistent with the Ukrainian strategy. The fourth item back in the nest is just in terms of big picture movements. There are also reports, though, that the Russians are attacking themselves in Luhansk, sort of along the line near Kupiansk through to Lyman. and that, or Lehman, and that the belief is that maybe attempting to draw some Ukrainian forces from the Bakhmut area, where they're also making slow but steady gains, more up toward the Luhansk region. And so I haven't heard whether the Ukrainians feel like they need to be adjusting force distribution, but just the idea is Ukrainians pushing significantly across that Zaporizhia border, and through a little bit into Donetsk around Bakhmut, whereas the Russians are pushing more in the east, in that Kupiansk to Lyman line. So we'll go through hands. I'll go to Exit first as co-host, and then I believe it was Wolverine. Go ahead, Exit.
I just wanted to make a clarification on the number of rounds that Ukraine is firing. They are currently firing 200 rounds per gun per day, which, just to put that in context, is quite a lot, to the point that it's actually starting to wear out loading crews, because each of those rounds are weighing like 45 kilos a day. I'm clearly not the military person, but somebody who knows these things let me know this as we were speaking here. So they definitely are firing a lot more rounds than they had been in the past.
Yes, and I know I've seen reports that you have to look at it much more on a local basis at the moment, where in some instances the Ukrainians actually have local fire superiority, but that it is uneven on that front as across the lines. Wolverine, go ahead.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me. It's a little windy out. A couple of different things is, one, with the breaching assets and stuff like that. The Ukrainians do have a lot of breaching assets, and it doesn't always have to be dedicated assets like the German OSINTs that got damaged, because a lot of their Russian-style and Soviet-style tanks, a lot of them actually are equipped with mine plows and or mine rollers, which are also used in those type of operations. But they also have, they didn't have that many UR-77s, but they did capture some as well. That's another asset that you need for breaching operations. But the biggest thing is you have to have a lot of support for these breaching operations. Like I said before, when I was in the Marines, we did our breaching operations. Our main breach team was literally 4 M1A1s, vehicle launching the line Miklik, 2 we call them basically combat bulldozers, and sometimes you'd have one more vehicle with the engineers in it to breach, to mark the lane. So, and when I saw that one that they did with where it showed the 2 damaged OSINTs and the Max Pro just sitting there, and you look at how far back the armor is, and you didn't see really any kind of Mikliks, whether they are UR-77s or Mark M58 Mikliks on hand. So one thing is that the Ukrainians seriously need to look at better training if they're going to keep on going like this, and how to clear minefields, because they should have all kinds of support there. They should they should have more tanks. They should artillery fires and stuff like that on hand. And if you don't provide that support for a breach team, your breach team is going to get wiped out, because the artillery guys should be worried about your far targets that you can't, visibly see all the times, and also your on-call targets. And then your local fire support is going to be the tank platoon with you, or tanks that are sitting there also, and those would be taking care of any close-in targets within 4,000 meters. For the T-72 variants and all that, maybe 3,000. But you don't see a lot of that. You don't see a lot of coordination. It's like you have 2 OSINTs going side by side, but with no fire support with them. And typically, what we do is we can do multiple breach points. Our training, normally we do 1 breach point, but like during OIF, we actually did multiple breach points. And when you do that, you only go through that one spot
where you've breached through. Now, does that give an area where the Russians say, "Oh yeah, we know they can, they can hit us"? Yeah, but that's also the one area that is cleared for your forces to punch through the breach initially, and then once you have more time and you start, depending on how far you push through the enemy's defenses, and then farther, it depends. You can sit there and clear a wider area off of the breach site, whether you use combat engineers just doing the old school style, or using more UR-77s and or the MICLICs that they have. So that's the biggest thing I've seen with it. I mean, every time I see those pictures with those Wissons there, I just sit there and shake my head and go, what the hell were they doing, and who was teaching them that? So that's a big thing, and that's it's another very complicated operation, because you're wide out in the open and the bad guys can see you, and it takes a lot of practice, and that's why when we had tanks, we practiced that thing all the time, and I mean all the time. Some other things like Exit was saying is about the artillery. Now you got to look at what artillery systems you're talking about, because some artillery systems, they can fire 200 rounds a day, and the dudes are like yawning because they're bored. 105 millimeter guns, those guns are easy to ram and load, no problem all day. Caesars, I've seen a lot of video of the Caesars. Those things are so automated, the dudes literally don't do anything unless they have to do a major reload. But that's not a huge thing. Some of the older Russian systems are not as easy, especially when you got to load ammunition, because eventually, no matter what, especially on the self-propelled guns, they may have so many rounds inside, but once you expand those rounds, then you have to reload the vehicle. But that's where they have ammo vehicles that go along with those self-propelled guns anyways. So you can sit there and punch out like 200 rounds in a 105 during the day, and they're probably not going to feel a whole lot, because they can rotate the guides. And that's a good thing is you don't always have to use the same guy to load the guns, especially when you have like a 777. All guys are trained to do every position on it. So if one guy gets tired, you can swap out another guy who is doing something else and give the guy, a break on that. And realistically, the hardest part about it is the guy who's got to, heft that big 155 round and load it onto the feed tray, like on the 777s. Everybody else's job is actually relatively easy. You got the guy pulling the lanyard. You do have the one guy who's got to, ram the 155 round into the breech. You got one guy who's loading the powder charge and stuff like that. So, you only have one or two guys who are really doing the backbreaking work of it. But because everybody on the gun is trained to do all the positions, you can rotate guys in and out, and to actually reduce the wearing down of personnel on those guns, instead of just keeping the same dude up there. If you're keeping the same dude up there all the time, not giving him a break, yeah, he's gonna hurt himself or do something stupid. But that's why you just swap the guys around, so that they keep on having someone fresh up on the gun and stuff like that. And if you want to look up. There's a video where they do Canadian. It's a bunch of some Canadians doing a 9-round fire mission on YouTube. And there's another one where Marines fire a 15-round fire mission, and these guys literally fired 7 155 rounds in a minute, and that's them busting ass. So, it's just rotating and going through that stuff and learning. But there's some other things, but I know there's other people who want to talk, so I'll stop there for now.
Thanks, Wolverine. With regard to the, equipment availability and sort of breaching technique, I know the Ukrainians have commented that they don't have all the systems that they would like, and that in some ways, resistance has been stiffer than perhaps they had expected. But hopefully we see, hopefully you're very pleased in the next couple of weeks as you see Ukraine getting to apply some more textbook breaching techniques. I know there are a couple of hands up. I think what I'm going to do is between speakers, I'll run through a couple of points, and then, we'll I'll do a couple of points. We'll have a speaker. I'll do a couple of points just so I can get a little bit deeper into the agenda. So having a look at the nest, the first item up there at the moment was an interesting breakdown and detailing of the second of the Russian main defensive lines. I believe that Emil had previously done an overview of all Russian defensive lines, but I think the idea is, as the Ukrainians are making progress, what are they likely to encounter, next in the next week or two, potentially. And so he does a good job with satellite analysis of breaking down the arrangement of those lines and composition of the defenses. So have a look at that. The second item back is an interesting strategic question. Some people have begun to look at the Kakova Dam territory, and for example, Thomas Tyner put out a tweet with a video saying, oh, it looks like the ground is firming up. Maybe a crossing is possible. And I know there's been debate about the wisdom of that. Our friend David Helms, who's been in to chat with us a couple of times, has taken the approach in the second item in the nest of looking at during World War II, when that reservoir did not exist, and there were actually crossings of the natural river in battles at that time, where did those crossings take place? Because in theory, at that time, the people doing the crossings would have looked up the best bridgehead locations. They may have been constrained by the battlefield realities, but it was a great thought that David had. So he breaks down where several of those historical crossings took place. So you might find that one particularly interesting. And then finally, in terms of offensive techniques, I wanted to highlight, I'm sure that many of you saw the initial use by the Russians last week of a VBIED, a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device, where they apparently filled a T-55 tank. It was claimed with 6 tons of explosives, and that particular vehicle was stopped through the use of anti-tank, shoulder-fired anti-tank rockets. So it was unsuccessful. It didn't make it to the line. However, since that time, 2 more videos at least have come out using similar techniques, different vehicles. In this particular video, the third item back in the nest, they used an MTLB. And in that case, it does appear that the vehicle made it to the Ukrainian line. And so it appears to be an emerging tactic. It's not clear whether it's localized to like a particular unit that seems to enjoy its use, or whether it will become more widespread. But once is sort of a quirk, but 3 times in just a few days suggests that it's very intentional. So I think John had been waiting, and then Wolverine was waving. So we'll go to John and then Wolverine. Go ahead, John.
Cool, thanks. Just for everyone's, for Wolverine's sake, I threw up that 15-round fire mission for the Marine Corps with the 155 in the nest real quick, because I have seen that, and I do come back and look at that every once in a while. Some of the other ones on all source. But I was going to make a quick statement, a point about the breaching operations. I think Wolverine covered most of it, and probably will, and parts of what I'm about to cover. But I think there's some key things that I don't see the Ukrainians doing right. I think there's some key aspects of breaching operations, and when it comes to how hard breaching operations are, I think they're right behind gap crossings, which I think are probably the top 2 hardest operations for an armed force to do, especially under fire when it's contested. And I think there's a couple key tenets that have to be that always need to be observed. And this is, obviously you got to have obscuration, suppression, violence of action, and multiple breach points, which is something that Wolverine covered. And I'm not seeing the obscuration or the suppression. And I think that Wolverine kind of alluded to that, you're not seeing that already support that they would need, and which would be part of the all-encompassing suppression, right, that you would need. And you're really seeing only like one initial breach point. And then very quickly what we saw so far, and I'm not trying to say that they can't learn from their lessons learned, but what we've seen so far is that they have a sole breach point, and then obviously already hones in on that location. And remember, a lot of these areas are probably pre-gridded already, or what they're doing is we're not even seeing breaching. We're seeing them using routes that are already set out, meaning these routes are probably already gridded, and the Russians have prepared strikes on these locations. You know, they've been pre-gridded, is exactly what I'm trying to say. But I'm just not seeing some of the core tenets, obscuration being the biggest one and suppression being the biggest one when it comes to breaching operations. And the big penetration that people talk about, or what a lot of people call the offensive, right? You're not going to get that unless you do the breaching operation correctly. You're not going to be able to penetrate without a correct breaching operation. It depends, unless you find a soft spot in the line or something like that, where that's not heavily mined or heavily entrenched. And I think that one last thing that I'd say is that breaching operations don't only have to be, in a minefield, right? You can breach a trench line, right, by using different means. But I believe it's the Euro 77s, which is what Wolverine mentioned, which is essentially, firing out this long rope of deck cord, which creates a huge detonation, which can essentially create your breach right through the I think when Cameron mentioned, or I believe it was Cameron mentioned, the lack of breaching vehicles, I think it's the specific, right, vehicles where the whole mission set of the vehicle is for breaching, and it not necessarily pods or rollers that you can add on. I think that's what they need more, is these vehicles that strictly do breaching, and I just don't know if they have the amount where they can take a large amount of attrition, or I don't think they're going to be able to reconstitute those if they don't get more. And obviously, the 155 ammunition is definitely a big thing. I haven't been able to look at the new drawdowns, specifically the newest one, to see how much, if there was any 155 in there. I would assume there was, so I'll let Cameron take that.
I got to go in just a minute, but I'll give a quick update on artillery ammo. So sorry to jump in ahead of Wolverine. That's definitely his spot. But yeah, no, there's been additional 155 in each drawdown, as well as AMRAMs and AIM-9Xs for the NASAM system seem to be in almost every drawdown now. Right now, it looks like Rheinmetall is going to be able to produce 600,000 rounds a year, including their purchase of Expal, which is a large Spanish manufacturer. I was looking through my notes the other day and totally forgot to bring this up, but Saab thinks they can hit 400,000 rounds a year by 2025, which that's more than the entire U.S. is making right now. And there were some U.S. announcements today that they have hit their goal of 24,000 a month, which is, I believe, 288,000 a year. And we are backfilling and borrowing ammo from South Korea and explosive filler now from Japan. So it looks like, again, not 100% of these will go to Ukraine, but it looks like we are well over the million mark in terms of ammo possibility for production. Although stockpiles are low and some countries are trying to replace their stockpiles. So it means that not 100% is going to go to Ukraine. But we should be looking at a multi-million figure for 155. I have some more specifics to provide later, but it just changes so much and is somewhat so secretive where the complete list I wanted to make doesn't seem as possible now.
So I guess my first reaction is I hadn't heard about Saab, so that's great news. I had heard the Rheinmetall and the U.S. numbers. When you say that the list you had made is not possible now, sorry, do you mean it's not achievable because you had thought a higher number was possible, or is it in the opposite direction?
Well, I mean that like certain manufacturers will release statistics. Particularly state-run companies don't like to release statistics on their production. So mine had nothing to do, like that statement, nothing to do with overall production. But I was saying, like, I can't get numbers for every company. So I can get numbers for a handful of companies. But after trying, there's a lot of companies, particularly in Eastern Europe, where I cannot get exact figures or even estimates on their size. So I'm just saying, like, I can't give an accurate estimate.
Understood. It's, tough work to track it all down. So I appreciate that you're looking at it in that level of detail. If you do have any breakthroughs, come back and let us know. I know you have to go in a moment. I'll also say to anybody listening, because occasionally we have people from that region, if anybody has connections with, the munitions industry in Eastern Europe, and you want to connect Cameron with some people who could give him some data, that would be great. So please keep that in mind. Wolverine, go ahead.
So in regards to the V bids, that's the term we use. Now the one where it was the T-54, T-55 tank, there are actually two different things that were actually used to stop that tank. Believe it or not, the first one is actually an anti-tank landmine, and that's why you saw it go off and steer off, because what they do is basically like they get like so far away, and they have a dude who's in the tank, and he starts driving the tank, and then like basically like ties the control levers or whatever, not to stay in the same speed and direction and stuff like that, and then it's remote detonated that is where it's the explosives are actually remote detonated. But the first time when you actually see that tank hit something, there's a big puff of smoke and it turns off to the left. That's when it hit the anti-tank mine. And then the second one, which is actually was kind of cool because you could actually see the rocket. There's an RPG-7 that actually hit the tank, and that's what caused the massive detonation. Now, the one thing also, which I can't remember who posted it, so I wasn't the one who initially said this, so I'm not taking the credit, but there is a gentleman who posted something, and what basically he said is that most of the explosion, at least in that IED, would actually have not have gone out left and right, or 360. It would actually gone straight up. And the reason being is because anytime you have an explosion, it's always going to look for the weakest point, right? It's demolitions and explosions. They're lazy. They just want to find the easiest way out, quite literally. So on the T-55, T-54, the easiest way out is the weakest point, which is the top of the tank. So what happens is you're not going to get the shrapnel that you think you would from the sides or the front. You're going to get more shrapnel thrown up and out and away from the tank than you would actually get from the tank actually getting blown apart.
So that's interesting question, Wolverine, is on that front. One thing that had occurred to me was when they use the tank in one attack and then like the MTLB in another, if the tank theoretically has thicker armor, does it act like a bigger pressure vessel so that when the armor is breached, the pressure wave would actually be more powerful by that point, or therefore more harmful from a pressure perspective, although less shrapnel?
It could be, and that's what I was actually getting ready to say. So you actually can see that what's that called? When the big explosion goes, but yeah, it basically could cause more like concussion type damage to individuals. The thing though is when you take an MTLB compared to like a T-55, you have to look at the difference in armor all around the vehicle. So believe it or not, an MTLB has basically the same amount of armor all the way around. It's the same thickness, it's like half an inch or something like that. But the thing that is that's even worse for the MTLB is the MTLB has, and I got to remember this now, it has a driver's hatch, it has a gunner's hatch, it has a engine compartment hatch, and then two troop hatches facing up, and then it has two troop hatches facing directly back. So your weakest points are actually going to be directly up and directly to the back, and that the evidence of that also is there when one of the pictures when they had one of those MTLB V bids go into an area where it didn't go off, you could actually see that all the explosives were actually in the back of the vehicle. So unless that vehicle actually got into an area and breached it, like if they were to stop it early enough, it probably wouldn't do as much damage as if the vehicle had actually gotten either online with the defensive positions or slightly past. Then they would have gotten more damage from the MTLB variant compared to the T-55.
Okay, well, thanks for those details. I see we'll go to Dean, and then I'll keep running through my updates. Go ahead, Dean.
I'm blind, so I got to fumble around, find a microphone using my voiceover. The other question I have is dealing with standard maintenance personnel question regarding the F-16s. Oh, thanks, Toshi. I realize that if some of the existing aircraft from other countries are routed through and be transferred there, that comes with the understanding that parts are available, although these assets will be getting heavier use, so that means their replacement parts will probably, the need for them will go up to some degree. That's not my area, so I don't know to what degree. But the other thing is even more important in my estimation at this point, the big unknown, are the trained maintenance personnel. Are we tracking, to the extent that it can be discussed, the training of maintenance personnel to be able to handle those increased air assets?
And so, for those who might not have or may have joined us more recently,
Mr.
I think.
Bond, unfortunately, you need to cycle just real quick. So I will just take a quick moment to remind everybody that if you're enjoying what you're hearing, you can go down into the bottom right-hand corner and there's that big purple button, and click on that and you'll be able to retweet the space and invite some other people to come in and listen to the conversation in here. As well, if you're looking for any of the tweets that are up in the nest, they are down underneath that purple button as well, and they will stay there going forward as if you ever need to come back and look at some of the sources we have. And I believe Mr. Bond is back.
Thanks for that. So for those who may have joined us more recently, Dean is stepping back in the conversation a bit. Toshi told us earlier about the possibility that Japan may export F-15 engines from, I guess, decommissioned F-15s because earlier models of F-16 shared the same engine. And so Dean is now asking about the training of maintenance staff. Dean, the thing that I've seen, and I mean, if anybody has seen more specifically, please do come up and let us know. But the thing that I've seen is that with many of these systems, including tanks and others, they've pointed out that the training of maintenance staff takes much longer in many cases than does the training of the operators. And that I don't think that training has begun either for pilots outside perhaps one or two isolated cases, F-16 pilots or F-16 maintenance staff. And so I haven't heard a discussion about how those maintenance staff would be trained up enough to be operating in Ukraine to maintain the aircraft. I've seen lots of people suggest that it's not going to be an issue, but I don't know what the specific solution to that is. In that I've seen it explained that in many Western countries, it often will take several years before a person performing maintenance on those aircraft move from essentially an apprentice's position into carrying out the repairs solo. And so I don't know whether the answer is sort of like a Tiger Team contractor situation or what. But if anybody knows how that's likely to be resolved, please come up and let us know. So essentially that's a non-answer, Dean, but that's the best I have for you at the moment.
No, you anticipated my follow-up, so that's great. I'll have to wait and see.
Yeah. Yep. And the estimates I've heard, so they're talking about setting up a training center for F-16 pilots somewhere in Eastern Europe. But again, they're still at the talking phase. And the United States came out previously and said that based on a couple of isolated, experiments at training Ukrainian pilots, that they could be trained in something like 2 months if they were already quite experienced pilots on other jet fighters. But even at that, we probably wouldn't, if the political hurdles to provide them were surpassed, training wouldn't start for some weeks at a minimum, and then it would be several months before even the first pilots were trained. And so there will be several months before the maintenance question reveals itself to us. But we'll see. Wolverine, go ahead.
So I just actually remember this. So I've actually read some of these are actually regular news articles. So General Dynamics has actually said that if Ukraine does get the F-16s, they will actually set up a facility in either, I can't remember, it was in Romania or in Poland, where they would actually service and conduct maintenance as needed on these aircraft. I don't think there's any charge or something like that, but that was the articles that I've actually seen about maintenance support for the F-16 once Ukraine gets them.
So I see we've been joined by Colby, who may speak directly to this. I know that that model of supplying aircraft to Ukraine, but then potentially performing maintenance outside of Ukraine is something that the Western supporters have tried to avoid so far. So I don't, that would be a significant change in approach. But we'll go to Colby and then to Toshi. Go ahead, Colby.
Thanks. So today the Pentagon said that Denmark and the Netherlands have lead on this, on the training of Ukrainians on the F-16, and that the United States is going to play a supporting role. They did not have a lot more to say than that, very vague, as they often are, but especially vague right now. It seems like, there's still some level of uncertainty about how all of this is going to work out. The reporting around Romania being a potential training location was mentioned. But, as we've discussed, there's, kind of two main components here to the training. There's the training of the actual pilots themselves, getting them comfortable flying the aircraft, probably simulators first, and then actually in the cockpit, learning the aircraft. And actually, there's two components to that as well. There's the technical side of the aircraft itself, but then there's the tactical portion, which a lot of people have actually said is the more difficult part. If you already know how to fly a fighter jet, you can learn to fly another fighter jet. Some people have been pretty confident the Ukrainians are going to pick that portion up pretty quickly, but you also have to learn the tactical side, how to properly employ that aircraft, understanding its capabilities, understanding the capabilities of the weapon systems, and understanding the tactics that go along with that, because NATO air forces have different doctrines than the Russians do around how to employ air power, which is based on the different systems available as far as radar and missiles and whatnot. And then there's the maintenance portion, right? You have to train the guys who maintain the aircraft, which is just as, if not more important, because aircraft are incredibly maintenance heavy weapon systems. They need a hell of a lot of hours of maintenance just for 1 hour of flying time. So that's a very crucial portion as well. And it seems like a lot of the discussions more focused on the pilots, when the maintenance question is just as important, because it's not like, tanks, they need maintenance as well. Artillery systems, yeah, they need maintenance as well. But you can get a decent amount of use out of those systems, before you're needing really significant maintenance, where that's not the case for aircraft. You fly one mission, it's got to have maintenance right away, basically. So sending the weapon systems without a plan to actually train Ukrainian ground crews and how to maintain these systems, it's not going to work out. So this is it's going to take time. There's a lot of unresolved questions. Is there going to be an ongoing maintenance plan that involves a third party outside of Ukraine? That would probably make it easier, but it's a little bit more politically fraught. So these are all questions that, are ongoing discussions as far as I can see. And the governments involved are, not willing to really come out with too many definitive answers on how it's going to work right now.
Thanks, Colby. Yeah, well, we'll have to wait and see. And given that this question was inspired by Toshi's comment about the F-15 engines, I'm glad that he's back. Toshi, go ahead.
Oh, yes, and I think it is, vehicle for the SUV, and if locating in second-hand engines, maybe somebody tried to almost the half broken Ford fix up by own self. So I think in a sort of the parts is a very important for the continue to the fighting by the Ukraine Air Force. And maybe Russians dreaming as they will soon of they will lost of the many of the fighters, and they will facing to the lack of the parts, and so next week or next month we will win. Maybe Russian Mr. Putin is dreaming such a scenario, but India, the Western countries is sending to the equipment, parts, and training place for in the NATO base. So I think it is very important to continue to the support to the Ukraine, not only the forces. By Japan, Japan is supporting to the reconstruction, rebuilding of the Ukraine sorry, I forget the English word. Infrastructure.
Infrastructure.
Yes, infrastructure.
Yes.
Thank you. Is supporting to the these building, dam, and hospital, schools. I think it is of course it is not work to the winning to this war, but it is a few. Please imagine, everybody is waiting of the end of the war, and after the win, somebody is helping to us, helping to you, is very good news, and they want to the hope. So I'm very glad to hear of the Japanese government is support to the restructuring of the broken infrastructures. Sorry, my speaking is pointless. Sorry. Thank you.
Well, certainly Japanese support for Ukrainian infrastructure is not pointless, and I'm glad you highlighted their generosity there. Okay, I'm going to get back to updates. We're making slow progress. What I wanted to highlight are some resources that give you context on losses so far. So if you look at the first item in the nest, it's a time series graph of losses just since the beginning of the offensive. This one was put together by Henry Schlottman, who does some great work. He doesn't appear to be as active on Twitter anymore, but this is drawn from his Substack. So if you are interested in his work, follow the link in this tweet out to his Substack, and you can see his analysis there. If you were more interested in tracking the losses in tabular format, broken down in a little more detail, the second item in the nest is a tweet from Nalcio, who's a friend of ours who works with both Oryx and Warspotting, and he is every couple of days putting a summary of losses just since the beginning of the offensive, which is quite helpful. Just updates on understanding losses, reminder of context. Just because something is reported as lost, that can include items that are damaged or abandoned. As an example, the third post back in the nest is the location where that one loss of Ukrainian equipment occurred, where there were several Bradleys and one Leopard that were lost at the same place. I've seen estimates from video footage that suggest that several of those vehicles are likely to be recovered and repaired. And this was more recent photography of the area showing that the vehicles are still there, but it's likely territory that Ukraine will have access to, if not now, then shortly. So just a reminder that not all losses are permanent losses. Go ahead, Exit.
I just was going to say that those particular ones, they were recovered the next day, is my understanding, because Ukraine had grabbed some ground about 2 kilometers in front of them.
Sure. So that particular photo from cloud may have been of a slightly different tank than the one that you're referring to. I do know at least one Leopard had been recovered for repair, but cloud, I think, was suggesting that there was another location where a Leopard had been damaged, and that even though damaged, it was in territory that the Ukrainians were getting access to shortly. Speaking of vehicle losses, I suspect that by now all of you have heard that Oryx has come out and said that he's going to be transitioning away personally from doing the losses lists. And so the fourth item back in the nest is it includes, it quote tweets Oryx's notice on the fact that he'll be moving on to something else. But then Jacob, who has been posting the updates for the last several months, has come out and explained that the plan he's coordinated with Oryx is that while Oryx will continue with several of his lists, I believe he said either until the end of the offensive or until the end of October, that after October, Oryx will cease to maintain any of the lists. And I think he's actually going to take some of them down. But that the Ukrainian and Russian lists will continue, and that Jacob plans to continue them as long as possible in order to maintain them sort of up to the standard that, or on the same principles of classification that Oryx had been maintaining. And that several of the members of Oryx's team, I believe, who had already been also working with the war spotting group, which was doing similar work but to different standards, many of them are going to continue there. And so war spotting hopefully will take up the torch. To that end, if you have a look at the fifth item back in the nest, it's a tweet from war spotting, who note that their standards are different and they want to set out why the numbers differ and how they classify things slightly differently. So if you're interested in how that all works out, have a look at the fifth item back in the nest, the tweet from war spotting. And then I guess I'll take a moment to say that I have and continue to rely heavily on the numbers that Oryx team put together, particularly early in the invasion when I started with those updates. Some of you may remember breaking down both Ukrainian and Russian losses in terms of percentage of committed vehicles. I found Oryx's updates really early, and I appreciate all the work that he put in. So I'm taking my moment to say thanks to Oryx and his team, and hopefully he finds some work that's rewarding, because I know that the losses lists were a hobby that essentially grew a life of their own. Okay, so the next part of updates, I just wanted to highlight several of the great mapping efforts, because as I said, we're not trying to be a group that is necessarily doing breaking news, but that there are several amazing mappers who are trying to be right up to the moment. So I'll put that as the first item in the nest. As a reminder, my approach generally is to look at a bunch of different maps separately, because each of the groups has different access to sources. I'll just highlight that in this, I've put up the single overview tweet, and it includes content developed by GeoConfirmed, Bellingcat, the Center for Information Resilience, Andrew Perpetua, the Institute for the Study of War, Poulet-Volant and the Ukraine control map put up by Project Owl. So there are a bunch of good ones in there. That's not all of them. Some of them have specialties. For example, the Bellingcat map is more of a civilian harm map as opposed to a frontline map. And I'll note, I should have it here in just a moment, that our friend Andrew Perpetua made an update to his maps today. Apparently it was a very significant update because he had been holding on to a lot of changes on the front line for several days, and he was just awaiting confirmation. So that appears now in the front of the nest as well. Okay. While you're perusing those maps for a moment, I'm just going to grab the updates for the next topic. I think we are likely moving. Oh, yeah. Yes. So we're moving into updates on Ukrainian equipment. As usual, we'll probably get through updates on Ukrainian equipment, the brief updates on Russian forces.
Excuse me, Mr. Bond. What about the occupation question? Since Toshi is here, might I?
Oh, so
they can answer to that one.
Yeah. So you the way you were referring to, I thought maybe you had DM'd with Toshi. So perhaps we'll take 2 minutes to do it now. Toshi, Dean had asked whether you think in Japanese politics, whether is it the Kuril Islands that remain disputed, whether that as a political matter is contributing to Japan's increased willingness to provide military assistance to Ukraine, perhaps, in opposition to Russian interest?
It is many of the factors, and I can say in one word. But some politicians tried to be close to the Russia, and in the past, and they tried to keep the good relationship, and finally, Kuril Island will be back, half, 1/3. But if some part is come back to Japan, maybe it's a big point, and it is a big success in the political issue in Japanese politician. So, but in real, in Japanese government is not point out to such a Kuril Island is own territory or Kuril Island is necessary for Japan. There are no such a argument in politician. Of course, in some of the SNS, some guys say it's time and it's time to back to our territory. But unofficially, very, very quiet. Nobody talk. It is a chance of the returning the territory. So, and I'm sorry to everybody. Everybody know in Japan tried to the World War II invasion to the world. I know, and I don't say to ignore such a fact. So now the Japanese people and Japanese government, we try to say to the invasion to another territory. So, of course, in Kuril Island is many of the seafood, and so some of the groups is try to act, and they take the profit by the sort of returning the territory. So, but 99% or 90% Japanese don't want the returning the back of the Kuril Island in this time, and also if try to such a acting, maybe Russia will take the Hokkaido Island within the next 10 years. So it is, I think, it is not good this act for the returning the Northern Territory for Japan. It is a very hot potato in the political matter in Japan, I think. Is it okay?
Yeah, thanks for that. Hopefully that answers Dean's questions. Okay, John, why don't you come in, but perhaps you can go quickly, and then we'll try and work through one or two more subjects before we wrap.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. Thank you. I was just wondering, essentially, is the Russian force posture now and potentially in the next 10 years going to be able to take these islands? I just would be I personally skeptical, and more so a question. It just doesn't seem, and also with the new revelations recently in the past couple of months of the lack of readiness in the Pacific Fleet, of the Russian Pacific Fleet, and the firing of the commander, which is indicative of the level of lack of readiness. So I was just wondering if that's even feasible for the Russians to do. I think they have been signaling they want to, but can they do it capability-wise, and not to mention with the losses of funds and resources in the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war?
Yeah, I don't know whether Toshi gives us lots of great updates from Japan and sort of on the public mood in addition to the news. I don't know, Toshi, do you have any insight into Russian force strength in that region, or is that a matter best left to military analysts?
Some of the Russian military specialists, Mr. Koizumi, also he is not no relationship to the ex-prime minister Koizumi, another family, another person. Okay, so he point out to the Russians is something trouble, sort of the supporting within Russia. So he's worrying about the past of the last year till the August. Russia will massive attack to Ukraine, and finally Ukraine will be lose. So, but still now in Ukraine is a good fighting. Of course, many of the losing of the soldiers, and many of the passed away of the civilians. So, but still now, and Ukraine is going in the fighting in well. So, and he said, Mr. Koizumi said, Russia has a big trouble within the system, supply or we don't know, but it is certainly they have a problem, and such as maybe I must say to the many of time in this space. Maybe you have heard to the Pochomkin village in the Ekaterina in Russian Empire, Queen Ekaterina era. Some high class is Pochomkin. They try to the good-looking villages when the queen went to the sort of the local place. So it sounds like maybe within the Russian forces, they are making a sort of the Pochomkin village everywhere, every place, every system. So now this Pochomkin village is not work in there. So I think, of course, I just only I'm read in a sort of news. That's all. But Russian have a sort of big, deep trouble within the system. So I think it is a very good news for us. And but Russia is not so stupid. Maybe somebody tried to fix up of the wrong place or bad place. So when it will finish to the fix up. So it is a big matter of this war, I think.
Okay, thanks, Toshi. So I normally run these spaces for 3 hours. I think on those wise words, I'm going to wrap up. I'd like to thank you all for coming to listen tonight. I'd like to thank all the speakers for coming to chat. I enjoyed our chat with Chris Bollinger. He was very insightful on use of AI, particularly in analyzing imagery and the application of those techniques to OSINT. That seemed like it was just the beginning of a conversation. Hopefully we'll have Chris back to dig into some other aspects. In particular, I'm going to follow up with him to get together some educational material on those who'd like to learn, a little bit more of the technical aspects that he referred to. Just a reminder that our next conversation is on Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. We do these talks twice a week. We may have lots of material lined up for Sunday already because we got through almost none of what I hope to talk about tonight. But it was a great conversation with our guest earlier. So thanks to all our speakers. Thanks to my two co-hosts. Without your help, it would be extremely difficult to hold these spaces. So hope to see everybody on Sunday afternoon, and have a great night.